It was supposed to be just another night out for Sarah and James, a quiet dinner at one of the city's most popular restaurants. But what started as a peaceful evening quickly turned into a nightmare when the restaurant owner, a man known for his strict policies, suddenly threw them out in the most humiliating way. The couple, who had been looking forward to a simple meal, never expected this kind of treatment. They hadn't caused any trouble, hadn't even raised their voices. They were just two people trying to enjoy an evening together. But as they walked out, heads lowered in shame, neither Sarah nor James knew that the real twist was just around the corner. As the night progressed, the restaurant owner would soon realize that the couple he had so hastily and rudely kicked out wasn't who they seemed. In fact, they were far from ordinary. What they would reveal next would not only shock the restaurant owner but would change everything about his future and the fate of his business. The restaurant owner, Carl, was a man who prided himself on the exclusivity of his establishment. He had built his reputation on providing a high-end dining experience, one that he believed only a certain class of people deserved. For years, his restaurant had catered to the city's elite, offering luxury in perfection. His reputation was important to him, and he often went to great lengths to maintain it. But over time, his attitude had become less about the food and more about who he thought deserved to sit at his tables. He had become picky, judgmental, and downright rude to anyone who didn't meet his standard. So, when Sarah and James walked in, Carl immediately sized them up. The way they were dressed, their demeanor, it didn't fit with his idea of the perfect customer. He looked down at them as if they were out of place. But instead of addressing them in a professional manner, Carl decided to act quickly. He wasn't going to waste his time on people who didn't belong, at least in his eyes. His decision was swift, and he wasted no time making them feel unwelcome. "Excuse me, but you're going to have to leave," Carl said curtly, interrupting Sarah and James just as they were about to take their seats. The words were cold, direct, and laced with arrogance. Neither Sarah nor James had done anything wrong. They had made a reservation, arrived on time, and were looking forward to a peaceful meal. But Carl didn't care. The tone of his voice left no room for discussion. He pointed them toward the door without a second thought. Sarah, who had been visibly shocked by the sudden outburst, tried to reason with Carl. "We have a reservation," she said, her voice trembling from the embarrassment. "We haven't done anything wrong. Why are you treating us like this?" But Carl, without even glancing at the reservation book, dismissed her completely. "I don't need to explain myself," he said, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of other diners. James, usually calm and collected, felt his anger rise. He was about to speak up, but Sarah stopped him. She could feel the tension in the air and knew that any further argument would only escalate things. Instead, they left the restaurant, humiliated and confused. Neither of them could believe what had just happened. As they walked to their car, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had triggered Carl's behavior. She had no idea what had gone wrong. James, on the other hand, was more focused on what they would do next. He was angry, but he wasn't about to let someone like Carl get away with it. Little did they know, the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next day, something extraordinary happened. Carl, the restaurant owner, was sitting in his office when his phone rang. It was a call that he had been dreading. The voice on the other end was calm, but the words that followed made his heart drop. The person on the phone introduced themselves as an executive from a powerful investment group that had been watching his restaurant closely for some time. They were interested in investing. In fact, they were eager to see how his establishment could grow. However, they had one condition: they needed to know about his treatment of customers, especially the ones he had treated poorly. Carl's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice betraying his panic. The executive didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You threw out a couple last night," they said. "I'm sure you know who they are." Carl's mind raced. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now, hearing these words, a sense of dread settled over him. He tried to play it off, pretending it was nothing important, but the executive wasn't buying it. The conversation ended with a chilling warning: "You need to make things right, Carl." You have no idea who those people are." The words hung in the air, leaving Carl in stunned silence. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure: his life was about to change. Later that day, Carl found out the truth. Sarah and James weren't just any couple. Sarah was the daughter of a wealthy entrepreneur who had built an empire from scratch, and James was a renowned investor who had quietly funded several successful businesses across the country. They weren't just wealthy, they were connected in ways Carl couldn't even begin to understand. The same people who had been watching Carl's restaurant were the very people Sarah and James had been working with for years. But it wasn't just their wealth or connections that stunned Carl, it was the fact that they had been testing him, observing how he treated others. They had known from the beginning what kind of person Carl was, and they had decided to teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. What would Carl do now? Would he apologize and hope to salvage his reputation, or would he try to ignore the consequences of his actions? The choice was his, but he couldn't escape the reality of the situation. As the tension built, Carl realized that this was no ordinary mistake, and he was about to learn a hard lesson in humility. The question remained, would he ever be able to make things right? Carl sat in his office, staring at his phone. The call had ended abruptly, leaving him with more questions than answers. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Who were Sarah and James, really? And what did the executive from the investment group mean when they said Carl had no idea who he had just crossed? It wasn't like Carl to feel nervous, but now, a gnawing sense of dread settled in the pit of his stomach. Something didn't add up. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship. His restaurant was the talk of the town, known for its luxurious ambience and high-class clientele. The waitstaff knew how to treat the rich and famous with the utmost care, and Carl had spent years cultivating an image of exclusivity. He had built his reputation from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let a couple of disgruntled diners ruin that. But now, as he replayed the events of the previous night in his mind, he realized he might have made a huge mistake. He had thrown them out without even asking the right questions. He had made assumptions based on their appearance, and now it was clear that those assumptions had been wrong, very wrong. It wasn't just the call from the executive that had Carl rattled. There was something else, something deeper. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the incident was more than just a simple case of a misunderstanding. There was a reason why Sarah and James hadn't reacted the way most people would. They hadn't gotten angry or tried to fight back. Instead, they had left quietly, their heads down, as if they were letting Carl's actions speak for themselves. It was almost as if they knew something he didn't. Something that made him feel like a fool. Carl knew he had to make things right, but he didn't know how. Apologizing would feel weak, he wasn't used to admitting when he was wrong. His pride had always been one of his most defining traits. And yet, something told him that an apology might not even be enough to fix the damage he had caused. These weren't just any customers he had wronged. These were people who had the power to destroy him if they chose to. As the day dragged on, Carl couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and James. He had seen their faces for only a brief moment, but they had left an impression on him. Sarah's calm demeanor, her unwavering composure in the face of humiliation, there was something about her that made Carl uneasy. And James, with his quiet confidence and steady gaze, had seemed like someone who didn't take nonsense from anyone. Neither of them had acted like ordinary diners. Carl had dismissed them too easily, and now he was paying the price. Around lunchtime, Carl decided to take action. He knew he couldn't just let this situation fester. He needed to find out more about Sarah and James. He needed to understand who they were, what made them tick, and why they had chosen his restaurant to make their point. It wasn't just about pride anymore, it was about survival. He made a few discreet phone calls, reaching out to contacts he trusted. He asked questions about Sarah and James, hoping to get a glimpse into their backgrounds. What he uncovered only deepened the mystery. Sarah was the daughter of a tech mogul who had recently made headlines for his groundbreaking work in artificial intelligence. He had started from nothing and built an empire that spanned across multiple industries. His company had recently secured a major partnership with several high-profile investors, including the very firm Carl had heard from earlier. James, it turned out, was not just an investor, he was a key player in some of the most lucrative deals in the country. His name was rarely mentioned in the press, but his influence was undeniable. He had a reputation for being sharp, calculated, and, most importantly, someone who knew how to make people pay for their mistakes. Carl's heart sank as the pieces started to fall into place. Sarah and James weren't just random customers. They were powerful, influential people with connections that could make or break a business like his. And yet, they had walked into his restaurant, expecting nothing more than a simple meal. They hadn't asked for special treatment, they had only asked for respect. But Carl had denied them that, and now he was paying the price. That night, Carl sat in his office, pondering his next move. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe he could make amends. Maybe he could find a way to salvage the situation before it got any worse. But how? How could he approach Sarah and James without looking desperate? How could he show them that he truly understood the gravity of his actions? He ran through different scenarios in his mind. He could send a formal apology, of course, but that seemed too impersonal. He could offer them a free meal, but what would that really prove? No, Carl knew that if he was going to fix this, he needed to do something bold, something that would make a lasting impression. The next day, he decided to take a more direct approach. He knew where Sarah and James lived, or at least where their business dealings were centered. He wasn't about to show up at their doorstep uninvited, but he could reach out through the right channels. He needed to prove that he was willing to go above and beyond to make things right. He called a few of his connections, asking them to help him get in touch with the couple. It felt like a desperate move, but Carl was running out of options. Meanwhile, Sarah and James had their own plans. Neither of them had forgotten the events of the night before, but they were in no rush to confront Carl. They knew that whatever he tried to do next, it would be too little, too late. They weren't interested in seeking revenge, they just wanted to make sure that no one else had to go through what they had experienced. They were used to people like Carl, people who thought they could dictate who belonged and who didn't. It was a game they had played many times before. But this time, the stakes were higher. Sarah had been quietly plotting her next move. She had connections of her own, people who could make Carl's life much harder if he didn't start playing by the rules. She didn't want to destroy his business, she just wanted him to understand what it meant to treat others with dignity and respect. And James, ever the strategist, had been making calls of his own. He had already put a plan in motion that would ensure Carl wouldn't be able to ignore the consequences of his actions. But for now, the game was still in its early stages. Carl didn't know what was coming, but he would soon find out. What he didn't realize was that he had already lost. The only question now was how much more he was going to lose before the end. Carl spent the next few days in a constant state of unease. The calls, the connections, the things he had learned about Sarah and James, it all felt like a web he had unintentionally woven, and now, he couldn't escape it. He had thought he was in control, a powerful figure in the world of fine dining. But with every passing moment, it became clear that Sarah and James weren't just another pair of angry customers. They were players in a game he hadn't even known existed. The tension was thick, and Carl's attempts to right his wrongs felt increasingly desperate. He had sent a few messages through intermediaries, trying to arrange a face-to-face meeting, but they had gone unanswered. It was like Sarah and James had vanished into thin air. Carl couldn't understand why they were avoiding him. Didn't they want the apology he was offering? Didn't they want to move on? But the truth was, it wasn't about Carl. It had never been about him. Meanwhile, Sarah had been quietly observing the fallout. She wasn't shocked by Carl's behavior. People like him existed everywhere, people who thought they could wield their power over others with no consequence. What surprised her, however, was how much he had underestimated her and James. It wasn't just about proving a point to Carl anymore. It was about sending a message to a wider world that still held on to these outdated ideas of who deserved respect and who didn't. It was about breaking down the barriers people like Carl had built, one experience at a time. Sarah's mind raced as she strategized her next move. she knew she couldn't let Carl's actions slide. His behavior wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. The way he had humiliated them, without knowing who they really were, was a reminder of how systemic prejudice still thrived in places people would least expect. It was time for him to learn the lesson that his position of power didn't make him untouchable. The world had changed, and Carl hadn't even realized it. James, on the other hand, had taken a more calculated approach. He had always been a thinker, a man who knew when to strike and when to wait. He was less concerned about revenge and more focused on how to use the situation to their advantage. He had started quietly investigating Carl's background, digging into his business practices, and looking for any cracks in his operation that might be exploited. He wasn't looking to ruin Carl's life, but if there was one thing James understood well, it was how to make people feel the weight of their mistakes without ever having to raise a finger. The situation was becoming a powder keg, and neither side seemed ready to back down. Carl, feeling cornered, began to second-guess his decisions. Every time he thought about reaching out to Sarah and James, he imagined them laughing behind his back, mocking his feeble attempts to fix the situation. It wasn't just the damage to his reputation that worried him, it was the fear that he had made a permanent enemy of two people who could destroy everything he had worked for. And for what? A fleeting moment of pride? He started to think about his staff. His waitstaff, his chefs, and the others who worked tirelessly to maintain the high standards of his restaurant. Carl had always believed in keeping his business separate from his personal issues, but now, everything seemed interconnected. He realized that his actions could have a ripple effect. If word got out that he had treated customers this way, the media would pick up on it, and his carefully curated image of exclusivity could come crashing down. He could lose everything, the restaurant, his reputation, his entire career. Carl didn't know how to undo the damage, but he knew that things were quickly spiraling out of his control. His attempts to smooth things over with Sarah and James were failing, and he could feel the pressure mounting. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. But there was something Carl didn't know. Sarah and James hadn't been idly waiting for him to make his move. In fact, they had already taken steps to ensure that Carl would pay for what he had done. James had reached out to several influential individuals within the city's business and social circles. He wasn't trying to manipulate people, he was simply making sure the right people understood the story. Sarah, for her part, had gone straight to social media, crafting a post that was both personal and powerful. It wasn't a direct attack on Carl, but it was clear enough that the message would get through. She was making her stance known, she wasn't someone to be mistreated, and she wasn't afraid to use her voice. The post went viral almost overnight. Within hours, Carl's name was all over the city's social media platforms. Comments poured in from people who had experienced similar treatment at his restaurant, from those who had heard about his reputation for turning people away based on their appearance, their social status, or even their race. Some of the comments were from former employees, others from customers who had once admired Carl's fine dining experience but were now reconsidering whether they wanted to support such a place. The storm had begun, and Carl was right in the eye of it. Carl had underestimated the power of a simple post. What he didn't realize was that the tide was already turning. Sarah's words had ignited something far beyond just an isolated incident. People from all walks of life were rallying behind her and James, sharing their own stories of being judged, excluded, or dismissed. The message was loud and clear: Carl's restaurant wasn't just a place where food was served, it was a symbol of the very prejudices people were trying to fight against. As Carl scrolled through his phone, reading through the comments, he could feel the walls closing in on him. Every word stung. His phone rang incessantly, but he ignored it, unable to face the people who were calling to offer their support for Sarah and James, or those who were simply taking pleasure in seeing him squirm. The restaurant's phone line was overwhelmed with calls from customers canceling reservations, and Carl could feel the weight of his actions beginning to crush him. But even as the storm raged outside, there was something Carl couldn't shake, a nagging feeling that this wasn't over yet. He had a sinking feeling that things were about to get worse. He had seen this before, the way the media swarmed around a story, amplifying every little detail. And though he hadn't yet realized it, the real danger wasn't from the press or the social media backlash. It was from Sarah and James, who were playing a much longer game than he had anticipated. They were prepared for this moment, and Carl had yet to realize just how deep their strategy went. As Carl sat there, his fingers trembling on his phone, he realized that the world was changing, and that the power he had once wielded over others was slipping away. But he had no idea what would come next, or just how much he was about to lose. The phone calls kept coming, each one adding to the suffocating pressure Carl felt mounting around him. His head throbbed, and his thoughts raced in circles. No matter what he did, it seemed like his world was falling apart. The restaurant was losing customers by the minute. People who had once sung his praises were now sharing their experiences of feeling discriminated against at his establishment. The phone was constantly ringing, but it wasn't just the media trying to get a statement, it was potential investors pulling back, associates reconsidering their partnerships, and even former employees voicing their anger at the way Carl had treated others. But what really unsettled Carl were the whispers, the rumors, and the slowly dawning realization that Sarah and James weren't just using social media to make a point, they were using it to destroy him. Carl had thought he could weather a storm, but this was something different. This wasn't just a public relations issue. This wasn't something he could simply apologize for and move on from. The damage had been done, and Carl was realizing it was far worse than he'd ever imagined. Despite the media frenzy, he still hadn't heard from Sarah or James directly. No apology was accepted, no meeting scheduled, nothing. The silence between them was deafening. It was as if they were letting the storm rage, watching it unfold, knowing full well they had already won. That realization was the hardest pill for Carl to swallow, that he had been played, expertly outmaneuvered in a game he didn't even know he was part of. One evening, Carl found himself pacing in his office. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, and the air was thick with the weight of everything that was happening. He had tried to salvage his reputation, reached out to his network of influential friends for support, but each call had gone unanswered, or worse, met with cold indifference. Even his most loyal patrons seemed to be reconsidering their loyalty. The few remaining reservations were being canceled one by one. He felt like the entire city was turning its back on him. As he sat back down at his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger, something that would make everything that had already happened feel like just the beginning. Sarah and James weren't the kind of people to just let things go. They had set their plan in motion, and Carl had no idea what they had up their sleeves. His mind raced, but every avenue he thought to take seemed like a dead end. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through the endless messages and notifications. Among the chaos, one name caught his attention. It was a message from a woman he didn't recognize. The message was short but chilling, *, you don't know what you're up against. But you will soon. *, no name, no signature, just a sense of foreboding that sent a cold shiver down Carl's spine. Was it one of Sarah and James' people? Or perhaps a new adversary entering the fray? The cryptic message only deepened Carl's unease, and the uncertainty of it all gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Sarah and James were working behind the scenes, taking careful steps to ensure Carl felt the full weight of their retribution. Sarah had reached out to a powerful PR firm, one known for its expertise in handling high-stakes situations. She wasn't just trying to make Carl look bad, she was setting him up for a downfall. The PR firm quickly began to dig into Carl's past, unearthing old scandals, unethical business practices, and rumors of mistreatment that had been buried for years. It was as though a veil was being lifted from Carl's entire career, exposing every crack and flaw he had desperately tried to keep hidden. James, ever the strategist, had quietly approached a few key media outlets, providing them with tips about Carl's less-than-reputable business dealings. He didn't need to push too hard, his reputation alone carried weight. Within days, the press had latched onto the story, painting Carl as a man who had always operated with a sense of entitlement, using his power and privilege to belittle those beneath him. The public narrative shifted, and now Carl was no longer just a restaurant owner facing a few bad reviews, he was a man under scrutiny, under attack from every angle. The tension continued to build. Carl knew it was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the impending collapse of everything he had worked for. He wasn't prepared for what would happen next, but he was beginning to suspect that the situation had long passed the point of no return. It wasn't long before Carl received another call. This one was different. It wasn't just an angry customer or a disgruntled former employee. It was a representative from the very investment group that had been eyeing his restaurant for months. The same group that had contacted him earlier, urging him to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The voice on the other end was cold and direct, almost as if they were delivering a final verdict. "We're pulling out," the representative said. "The entire group is reconsidering our involvement with your restaurant. The situation has become untenable." Carl's stomach dropped. He had been working with this group for years, counting on their financial backing to keep his restaurant afloat. Without them, he would lose everything. But there was no room for negotiation. The deal was off, and Carl's reputation had become a liability. The blow was devastating, but it wasn't the worst of it. Just as Carl was processing the implications of losing his investors, the phone call took an even darker turn. "You should have treated them with more respect," the voice said. "But now you'll learn what happens when you cross the wrong people. Consider this a warning." The line went dead, leaving Carl with a sinking feeling in his chest. Who were these people? Who had they really been all along? Sarah and James were no longer just customers or even adversaries. They were power players in a game Carl had no idea he had entered. They had built the perfect storm, and now, with everything crashing down around him, Carl was left wondering if he had any way out. His restaurant was collapsing, his financial backing had evaporated, and the city's eyes were on him, waiting for the inevitable fallout. But what Carl didn't know was that Sarah and James were just getting started. They had orchestrated the perfect plan, and Carl's destruction was only the beginning. As the night drew in, Carl sat in his office, staring at the pile of messages, phone calls, and emails he hadn't been able to respond to. The walls felt like they were closing in even more now, and he knew the worst was yet to come. But what could he do? What chance did he have against an enemy so skilled at pulling strings from the shadows? All Carl could do was wait for the storm to hit its peak. And when it did, he had no idea how much more he would lose. Carl sat motionless in his office, a sinking feeling gnawing at him with each passing minute. The weight of the world seemed to hang over him, suffocating him in the silence. The phone had stopped ringing, but that only made the tension more palpable. Every creak in the building, every distant sound, felt like a reminder that everything he had worked for was slipping away. He was trapped in a storm of his own making, and there seemed to be no escape. Just as Carl began to entertain the thought of locking himself away and letting the whole thing blow over, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call from a disgruntled customer or a curious journalist. It was an email, its subject line short and simple, *, "We need to talk." *, Carl's heart skipped a beat as he clicked open the email. The message itself was brief, yet the implications of it sent a chill down his spine. *, "We know what you did. We have everything we need to make sure it's not just your restaurant that suffers. You'll be hearing from us soon." Carl read the email over and over, trying to make sense of it. He had already lost so much, but now it seemed like someone else was threatening to push him even further into the abyss. Who were these people? Was it connected to Sarah and James? Or had the situation escalated to something even more dangerous? The uncertainty gripped him tighter, leaving him paralyzed with fear. It wasn't just his reputation at stake anymore, there was something much darker lurking on the horizon. As the hours passed, Carl couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. His every move felt under scrutiny, like someone was always one step ahead of him. He couldn't tell if it was paranoia or if the pressure had finally taken its toll, but it didn't matter. Whoever was behind this was clearly playing a long game, and Carl was just another pawn in their hands. The following day, the weight of his isolation became unbearable. His staff had been told to stay home, reservations had been canceled, and his personal phone line had been flooded with messages from those who had distanced themselves from him. The sense of loss was palpable. But what truly made Carl uneasy was the feeling that someone, or something, was closing in on him, ready to deliver the final blow. That night, as Carl sat in his office, staring at the messages flooding in and considering what little he could do to stop the tide from swallowing him whole, the door creaked open. It was subtle at first, just a crack, and for a moment Carl thought it was the wind. But then it opened wider, and a familiar face stepped into the room. It was Sarah. Carl froze, his pulse racing. What was she doing here? Why wasn't she staying in the shadows like before? Sarah had always been a mystery, a woman who had played her cards close to her chest. But now, standing in the doorway, her presence was magnetic, almost unnerving. Carl's first instinct was to speak, to apologize, to plead for mercy, but the words stuck in his throat. Sarah stood there for a long moment, just watching him. There was no anger on her face, no visible emotion at all. She was calm, almost detached, as if she were assessing him like an object rather than a person. Carl felt small in her presence, and for the first time in a long while, he understood what it meant to be powerless. "I see you've been trying to fix things, Carl," Sarah said, her voice smooth, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down his spine. "But I'm afraid you're too late." Carl opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah raised a hand, silencing him. "This isn't just about you anymore. You think you're the one being attacked? You think your restaurant is the only thing at risk? You have no idea what's coming next." Carl's heart pounded in his chest, but he still couldn't find the words. "What do you mean? What else could there be?" Sarah's lips curled into a faint smile. "You've made a lot of enemies, Carl. Not just from people who've been hurt by you, but from people who've been watching you for a long time. The reason James and I were able to get so much leverage? It's because we knew exactly how to play the game. And now, well, now it's your turn." Carl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "What do you want from me?" Sarah's smile deepened, her eyes cold and calculating. "It's not what I want. It's about what's coming for you. You see, when you treat people like pawns, you forget that some of them have connections far more powerful than you could ever imagine. This whole thing? It's just the beginning." Before Carl could respond, Sarah turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the deafening silence that followed. His mind raced. Connections? Powerful people? Was Sarah part of something bigger than he had realized? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? As Carl sat there, the tension mounting once again, his phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen, sent from an anonymous number. Asterisk, the game has changed. You've been warned. It's time to pay the price for your actions. Asterisk, Carl's hand trembled as he reached for the phone, but when he tried to open the message, it was gone. Just like that, vanished without a trace. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The feeling of being trapped deepened. There was no longer any way to escape. No way to undo what had been done. What was this really about? Who was behind all of this? Sarah and James were merely the catalysts, the ones who had sparked the fire, but they weren't the real players in this twisted game. There were forces at work here, forces far beyond Carl's control. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the otherwise silent room, each second dragging Carl deeper into the uncertainty. He had no way of knowing how long this nightmare would last, or what it would cost him in the end. One thing was clear, he was in way over his head. And now, with his entire world crumbling, Carl was about to learn that the true consequences of his actions were far more severe than he could ever have anticipated. Carl couldn't take it any longer. The weight of everything, his crumbling business, his shattered reputation, the shadowy threats looming over him, had reached a breaking point. Every part of him screamed for answers, for closure, for some kind of redemption. The silence from Sarah, the cryptic messages, and the mysterious powers behind it all were eating away at him. He had to know what was really happening. With a surge of desperation, Carl reached for his phone. It was time to confront the truth, even if it meant losing everything. He dialed the one number he hadn't dared to call yet, the number of the PR firm Sarah had hired. It rang, and for a moment, he wondered if he was wasting his time. But then, a voice on the other end answered, cold and professional. "Mr. Davenport," the woman said, as though she had been expecting the call. "We've been waiting for you." Carl's heart dropped into his stomach. "What's going on? Why are you doing this to me? What do you want?" The woman on the other end didn't flinch. "It's not what we want, Carl. It's what you've done. You've built an empire on disrespect, on people like Sarah and James who had nowhere else to turn. They weren't just trying to ruin you. They were trying to save themselves and others from the same treatment." Carl's mind was racing. "I didn't know. I didn't know that I hurt people like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. You didn't want to know," the woman replied. "That's the problem. You made choices, and now you're facing the consequences." The words hit Carl like a punch to the gut. He had spent so long ignoring the cracks, assuming they would fix themselves or disappear. But they hadn't. And now, as the storm he had fueled raged all around him, Carl finally understood the cost of his actions. But there was still one thing left to unravel, one last piece to the puzzle. "I need to talk to Sarah," Carl said, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. "Please. I need to understand." There was a pause on the other end, and then the woman's voice softened just a fraction. "It's too late for that, Carl. Sarah and James have already moved on. They're no longer just trying to expose you. They're working towards something much bigger, something you're not even a part of anymore. What's coming next is far beyond your control." Carl's mind spun in confusion. What did she mean? Had he really lost everything, or was there still some chance of redemption? His questions swirled unanswered, but one thing became clear: the world he had known, the world he had controlled, was gone. And what was left in its place was far more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. Just as Carl was about to hang up, the woman's voice came through one last time, sending a chill down his spine. "You may not know it yet, but you're already part of something much bigger than you realize. And when the truth comes out, you'll wish you had stayed out of it. But by then, it'll be too late." The call ended, leaving Carl alone in the silence of his office, the weight of those words hanging in the air. His world was unraveling faster than he could process. But as he sat there, staring at the empty screen of his phone, an unexpected thought crossed his mind. What if Sarah and James weren't the only ones orchestrating this? What if they had been mere pieces in a larger game, manipulated by forces beyond their control? Who were the real players, and what did they want from him? Carl felt the walls closing in once more, but this time, the danger wasn't just from the world outside, it was from forces within, and he didn't know if he could ever escape them. The next morning, as Carl made his way to the restaurant one last time to face the wreckage of his empire, he was met by a crowd gathered outside. The reporters, the curious onlookers, the disgruntled former employees, all waiting for his next move. But as Carl approached, his heart skipped a beat. He saw something he hadn't expected: Sarah, standing in the front, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him with an unreadable expression. And beside her, standing tall and proud, was James. For a moment, Carl wondered if they had come to finish what they started, to put the final nail in his coffin. But what Sarah said next left him speechless. "It's over, Carl," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "This was never about you or your restaurant. It was about something much bigger, a bigger injustice that needed to be exposed. We've already done our part. The truth is out there now. You can't hide from it anymore." Carl blinked in disbelief. What truth? What were they talking about? Before he could respond, a sleek black car pulled up at the curb. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a tailored suit, someone Carl didn't recognize but whose presence commanded immediate attention. The man walked towards Sarah and James, his eyes locking onto Carl with a sharp, calculating gaze. "Sarah," the man said, nodding in acknowledgement. "James. The plan's in motion. Carl, you're just the first piece. The rest of it, the real story, will unfold soon. You can't outrun it." Carl stood frozen, his entire body trembling. The truth that had seemed so elusive for so long was beginning to piece itself together. It wasn't just Sarah and James who had orchestrated this entire downfall. There were people with power, people Carl had never even considered, who were now standing at the center of everything. The wheels were in motion, and Carl realized, with a sickening certainty, that he was too far down the rabbit hole to ever climb out. The man in the suit glanced at Carl one last time before turning to Sarah and James. "Make sure he doesn't get in the way. It's time to take the next step." And with that, the crowd parted, leaving Carl standing alone on the steps of his former restaurant, his empire crumbling around him. As the car drove away, he realized with a jolt that everything had been leading to this moment, and he was only the beginning. The twist wasn't just in his fall. It was in what came next, and he was powerless to stop it. Carl stood frozen on the steps of his former restaurant, watching as the black car disappeared into the distance. His empire, his reputation, and everything he had built were now mere echoes in the past. As the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves, Carl realized that his life had been irrevocably altered. The game was no longer about him, it was about something far larger than he could have ever imagined. As the final remnants of the crowd melted away, Carl found himself standing alone, overwhelmed by the weight of the decisions he had made and the consequences they had unleashed. He had spent so many years building an empire, treating people like pawns, never realizing that one day, the pieces would turn on him. He had always believed that he could control the game, that the rules didn't apply to him. But now, those same rules had come crashing down on him, and there was no escape. A few days later, Carl received another email, this one much more detailed than the last. It was from the anonymous group that had orchestrated his downfall. The subject line read, "*the next phase. With a shaking hand, Carl opened it, his heart pounding in his chest. The email detailed everything, the full extent of the plan, the powerful people involved, and how he had been merely a stepping stone in a much larger operation. The group, it seemed, had targeted Carl not just for his past actions, but because he represented everything wrong with the system they were determined to expose. Carl read through the message in disbelief. His actions had unknowingly played into a much larger narrative. Sarah and James had been more than just victims of his mistreatment, they had been part of a larger movement. A movement aimed at exposing corruption, inequality, and the exploitation of vulnerable people. Sarah, with her quiet determination, had been a catalyst, and James had been a key player in the shadows, working with people Carl never would have guessed. They hadn't been out to ruin him, they had been trying to make him face the very consequences he had avoided for so long. They were fighting for justice in a system that had failed countless others, using Carl as an example of what happens when those in power forget their humanity. The truth was more complex than Carl could have ever understood at the time. But now, he understood. And for the first time, he felt a wave of guilt and regret. He had seen Sarah as just another person to control, someone he could manipulate for his own gain. But in truth, she had been trying to fight for something bigger than herself. The same went for James, whose quiet strength had been hidden behind the shadows of Carl's arrogance. Together, they had worked toward a cause Carl had never even noticed. The email also mentioned that the restaurant was no longer Carl's to run. It had been sold off as part of a larger plan to fund the efforts of the group. His business, once his pride and joy, was now nothing more than a distant memory. The new owners had big plans for the space, plans that would ensure it would never again be used to perpetuate the kind of culture Carl had fostered. In a way, Carl realized, the sale of the restaurant was a final act of justice. It wasn't just a financial blow, it was a symbolic one. The people who had been hurt by his actions, directly and indirectly, were taking back control. The place where Carl had once sat at the top, looking down on others, was now a place of healing and redemption. Carl spent the next few weeks in relative silence. The media frenzy had died down, but the damage to his reputation remained. He had lost more than just his business, he had lost his sense of purpose, his identity, and his belief that he could control the narrative. The weight of it all felt unbearable at times, but it also gave him time to reflect. He started reaching out to people he had wronged, one by one. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he could try to make amends. The first person he contacted was his former assistant, someone he had treated with disdain. She had been one of the first to leave after the scandals broke, and Carl knew she had felt the sting of his arrogance. He sent her a heartfelt message, asking for forgiveness. To his surprise, she responded. She didn't offer forgiveness right away, but she appreciated that Carl was finally acknowledging his mistakes. From there, Carl reached out to others, former employees, customers who had felt slighted, and even a few competitors. Some responded with kindness, while others rejected his attempts at reconciliation. But the important thing was that he was trying. He was learning the value of humility and the importance of understanding the pain he had caused. As the weeks turned into months, Carl's life slowly began to take on new meaning. He wasn't the powerful restaurant owner anymore. He wasn't the man who could snap his fingers and have things go his way. He was just Carl, a man who had made mistakes and was now trying to learn from them. One day, Sarah reached out to him. It wasn't what he expected, no harsh words, no judgment. Just a simple message, *, we're all just trying to do better. I hope you find a way to make things right, Carl. Take care. It was short and to the point, but it was the closure Carl needed. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a sign that there might be a chance for redemption, a chance for him to rebuild his life, not on the ashes of others, but from a place of genuine understanding and growth. And as Carl stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he realized that his life wasn't defined by his success or failure in business. It wasn't defined by the restaurant or the wealth he had accumulated. His life was defined by the choices he made, the people he impacted, and how he chose to rise from the consequences of his actions. In the end, Carl didn't return to the restaurant world. He didn't try to build a new empire. Instead, he used what he had learned to help others. He volunteered at community centers, worked with those who had been affected by the same systems he had once been a part of, and made it his mission to help those who needed it most. The story of Carl's fall from grace was one of lessons learned too late. But it was also a story of redemption, a story of a man who, when faced with the consequences of his own actions, chose to change, not for the world around him, but for himself. It wasn't the kind of ending Carl had ever imagined for his life, but it was the kind of ending that brought him peace. And as he moved forward, Carl knew one thing for sure: he was no longer the man he once was. He was someone new, someone trying to be better, one step at a time. And in that, he found a kind of freedom he had never known before. The days began to blend together for Carl as he embraced his new life, though each day still carried the weight of his past. His journey toward redemption wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, and there were times when he wondered if the scars left by his previous actions could ever truly fade. But slowly, the small steps he took, the changes in his attitude, and the effort he put into repairing the relationships he'd broken started to make a difference. As Carl began to volunteer at local shelters and offer advice to young entrepreneurs, he found himself not just helping others, but learning more about himself. He had always been driven by success, but now, he was motivated by something different, the desire to make a real difference, not just for his own gain, but for the people he had once overlooked and mistreated. It wasn't just the people in the community who noticed the changes. His former colleagues and competitors, those who had distanced themselves from him during his downfall, began to see him in a new light. Some of them even reached out, offering support and guidance. Carl had always believed that people who succeeded did so by stepping over others, but he now understood the power of collaboration and humility. Sarah, though still distant, occasionally sent him a message, always brief but thoughtful. Carl knew that trust would take time to rebuild, but he appreciated the subtle signs that she was open to the idea of forgiveness. She wasn't the same woman he had first met, a woman he had dismissed as just another person to control. She had grown, too. She had a fire in her, one that Carl had come to respect. One day, out of the blue, Carl received an invitation from Sarah. She was hosting a charity event, one that aimed to raise awareness about inequality and help people from all walks of life. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was important, and Sarah wanted Carl to be a part of it. She made it clear that she wasn't inviting him to seek redemption but to contribute meaningfully to the cause. Carl knew this was a chance, a real chance, to show that he had changed. He could no longer hide behind the walls of his past. This event, this moment, would be the test of whether his journey toward redemption had been genuine or just an attempt to patch up the pieces of a broken life. The night of the event, Carl stood at the back of the small, intimate gathering, watching as Sarah addressed the crowd. She spoke with confidence, passion, and purpose, the very qualities he had once tried to suppress in her. Her words echoed in his mind as he listened, realizing just how much he had underestimated her, and how much he had learned from the very people he had once treated as beneath him. As the evening unfolded, Carl found himself speaking to a few of the attendees, people who had struggled to make a living, who had faced discrimination, who had fought for their voices to be heard. These were the kinds of people Carl had once dismissed, but now he saw their strength, their resilience. He realized how little he had truly understood the world until he was forced to confront the damage he had caused. By the end of the night, Carl didn't feel the sense of accomplishment or victory he had once craved. Instead, he felt something more profound, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had done something good, something meaningful. He had taken a small step toward mending the broken parts of himself. And though he still had a long way to go, he understood that real redemption didn't come in one grand gesture, it came in the steady, consistent work of becoming a better person. The next day, Carl received another message from Sarah. This time, it was more than just a brief note. She thanked him for his support, for showing up and engaging with the cause. She acknowledged that their relationship had been complicated, but she also expressed hope that they could continue to work together, even if only in small ways. For Carl, this message was a turning point. He knew that while the past couldn't be erased, the future was still open to him. There was no magic moment when everything would be fixed. No one would suddenly forget the mistakes he had made, and he didn't expect them to. But as he read Sarah's words, Carl understood that redemption was not about erasing the past, it was about owning it and using it to build a better future. As the months went by, Carl continued to live with the lessons he had learned. He stayed committed to helping others, never forgetting the humility he had gained through his own fall from grace. His new life wasn't easy, and the path to redemption wasn't linear. There were days when Carl questioned whether he was truly changing, or if he was just putting on an act. But the small, everyday acts of kindness, the willingness to listen and learn, helped him find meaning in the process. One afternoon, as Carl walked through the city, he spotted a familiar face. It was one of his former employees, someone who had worked with him when the restaurant was at its peak. The man looked different, he seemed more confident, more at ease. Carl's first instinct was to turn away, unsure if the man would want to speak to him after everything that had happened. But to his surprise, the man walked up to him with a smile. "I heard about the charity event," he said. "You're really doing something different now, huh?" Carl nodded, unsure of what to say. But the man continued. "I just wanted to thank you. You know, back when you were running the place, I never thought you'd change. I thought you'd always be the same arrogant guy. But seeing you out there, trying to make a difference, it's inspiring." Carl felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was progress. It was a sign that he was moving in the right direction. As the sun set that evening, Carl stood at the edge of the city, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't expect to. But he had come to understand something vital. The journey of redemption wasn't about reaching an endpoint, it was about the continuous effort to do better, to learn from the past, and to make choices that reflected the person he was trying to become. And in that moment, as he looked out over the city, Carl realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was finally on the right path. It was a path filled with uncertainty, yes, but also with hope. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew it was a path worth walking. Carl's journey was far from over, and as time went on, he found that the road to redemption wasn't always as clear as it had seemed in those early days of change. Sometimes, the weight of his past would creep in, threatening to pull him back into old habits. There were moments when doubt would cloud his judgment, and he would question if he was truly capable of being the man he hoped to become. But then there were also moments, small, yet significant, when Carl could feel a shift in himself. He saw it in the eyes of the people he helped, in the way they trusted him, in the gratitude that quietly echoed through their words. He knew he wasn't perfect, that he would never fully erase the mistakes of his past. But he also knew that he could make a difference, not by erasing those mistakes but by learning from them, and by using his experiences to guide others on their own paths. One day, as Carl was walking to the community center where he volunteered, he ran into James, the quiet, calculating man who had once been just a shadow in the background. James had been one of the key players in the plan that had helped expose Carl's wrongdoings, and Carl had come to respect him more than he had ever imagined. The man he had once seen as a mere pawn in his life was now someone he admired. "Carl," James greeted him with a nod, a look of understanding in his eyes. "I've been hearing about the things you've been doing. You're really making an impact." Carl paused, unsure how to respond. "I'm trying," he said simply. "It's not easy, but I know it's the right thing." James smiled faintly. "I always knew you had it in you. Just took a little push, huh?" Carl chuckled, a dry laugh escaping him. "A big push. But you were right, James. I didn't get it before. I didn't see the harm in how I was living. But now, I can't unsee it." The two stood there for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. But for the first time, Carl didn't feel the need to defend himself or explain his actions. There was no animosity between them, just an understanding that they had both been part of something larger than themselves. It was a quiet moment of mutual respect, a step toward healing. Over the next few months, Carl's transformation continued. He spent more time with people who had been affected by systems of inequality, listening to their stories, learning from their experiences. The more he gave of himself, the more he understood the deep-rooted issues that existed in society. He realized that the change he sought wasn't just about him, it was about working with others, lifting them up, and creating a community where everyone had a chance to succeed, not just the privileged few. As Carl worked alongside others to create initiatives that supported marginalized communities, his reputation slowly shifted. The media, who had once painted him as the villain, began to take notice of his efforts. He wasn't just a fallen businessman, he was a man who was actively seeking to make things right. His story was no longer just one of scandal and disgrace, it was one of growth, transformation, and hope. But even as Carl moved forward, he knew the shadows of his past would always linger. They would serve as reminders of the man he had been, but also of the man he was trying to become. He would never be able to completely escape the consequences of his actions, but he could work toward a future where those actions no longer defined him. One evening, as Carl sat in the quiet of his small apartment, he received an unexpected letter. The envelope was simple, with no return address, just his name scrawled across the front. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was from Sarah. She wrote of the progress the charity had made, of the people they had helped, and how much it meant to her to see Carl's commitment to the cause. There was no forgiveness offered, not yet, but Sarah acknowledged the strides he had made. She expressed her hope that one day they could work together again, not as they had before, but as partners in something bigger than either of them. Carl stared at the letter, the words sinking in. It wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation, but it was a start. It was a sign that, while the past couldn't be undone, the future was still unwritten. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, and that some wounds took longer to heal than others, but the fact that Sarah had reached out in this way gave him hope. For the first time in years, Carl felt at peace with himself. He wasn't the man he had been, and he wasn't yet the man he hoped to become. But he was on his way. And in that quiet moment, Carl understood that the journey itself, filled with setbacks, learning, and growth, was just as important as the destination. There was no perfect end, no flawless redemption. It was all about trying, again and again, to do better. As he folded the letter, Carl took a deep breath, ready to face whatever the future held. He had learned to embrace his imperfections, to acknowledge his mistakes, and to find strength in the journey of change. And though he knew it wouldn't be easy, he was determined to keep walking the path that had already begun, a path that had already made him a better man, one step at a time. And so, Carl's story didn't end with a grand resolution or a neatly tied-up conclusion. It ended with the simple, everyday choice to keep trying, to keep learning, and to keep moving forward. It ended with the understanding that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a lifelong pursuit, a never-ending process of striving to be better, for himself and for the world around him.